She had not planned to come home early that day. The idea came suddenly, like a quiet thought that refused to leave her mind. The morning had started like any other, slow and heavy. Filled with routine tasks and polite smiles she shared with people who barely noticed her tired eyes. She finished her work earlier than expected and stood outside the building for a moment, holding her bag, unsure why her heart felt restless. Instead of calling home, she chose to walk straight back, telling herself it would be a small surprise for everyone. The walk home felt longer than usual. Each step carried memories of the years she had spent trying to keep her family together. She often felt like the glue that held everything in place, even when no one said it out loud. The street was familiar, lined with old trees and quiet houses that had seen generations grow and change. As she reached her gate, she noticed it was not fully closed. That small detail made her pause, but she pushed the thought aside and went inside. The house was unusually quiet. No sound of laughter, no television noise, no familiar voices calling out to greet her. She placed her bag down slowly and took off her shoes, listening closely. The silence felt heavy, almost uncomfortable. She called out softly, but there was no answer. A strange feeling settled in her chest, not fear exactly, but a sense that something was different today. She walked further inside, noticing small details she usually ignored. A cup left on the table, cold and untouched. Shoes placed near the door that should not have been there at this hour. The air inside the house felt tense, as if it was holding a secret. She told herself she was imagining things, that families had quiet days sometimes. But her steps slowed as she moved toward the living room. Her thoughts wandered to the past. She remembered when the house used to feel alive, full of noise and careless joy. Back then, problems seemed smaller, easier to fix with a simple conversation or shared meal. Over time, words had become shorter, silences longer. Everyone lived together, yet far apart, each carrying their own worries without sharing them. She reached the hallway and stopped. From behind a partially closed door, she heard faint sounds. Not loud enough to understand, but clear enough to know someone was there. Her heart began to beat faster. She had not announced herself, and no one knew she was home. She hesitated, unsure whether to move forward or turn back and make her presence known. A memory crossed her mind of countless times she had ignored her instincts for the sake of peace. She had learned to accept half answers and forced smiles, believing that love meant patience and sacrifice. But standing there, listening, she felt a strong pull to know the truth, whatever it might be. She took a deep breath and walked closer. The door was not fully shut. She stood still, her hand hovering near the handle. The voices inside grew clearer, though still unclear in meaning. Her mind raced with possibilities, none of them comforting. She reminded herself that she was a part of this family, that she had every right to be there. Slowly, she pushed the door open. The scene inside did not make sense at first. Her eyes tried to understand what they were seeing, but her mind lagged behind. It was not what she had expected, yet it felt deeply wrong. She felt a sudden rush of heat and cold at the same time, her breath catching in her throat. For a moment, she simply stood there, unable to move. She stepped back quietly, closing the door without making a sound. Her hands were shaking, and she leaned against the wall to steady herself. Questions filled her mind, one after another, each heavier than the last. How long had this been happening? How had she missed it? Was it her fault for being too busy, too tired, too trusting? She walked away from the hallway and sat down in the kitchen, staring at the table. The same table where they had shared countless meals, birthdays, and quiet evenings. It looked the same as always, but now it felt unfamiliar, like it belonged to someone else's life. She pressed her palms together, trying to calm herself. Her thoughts returned to the early days of her family. She remembered the promises made, the dreams spoken out loud with hope and confidence. They had believed that love alone would be enough to face anything. Somewhere along the way, those promises had faded into routine, replaced by unspoken expectations and silent disappointments. She realized how often she had chosen to stay quiet to avoid conflict. How many times she had sensed something was wrong but decided not to ask. She had convinced herself that time would fix everything, that things would improve on their own. Sitting there now, she understood how dangerous that belief had been. The house remained quiet, but it no longer felt peaceful. Every sound felt louder, every second heavier. She wondered if anyone inside had noticed her presence, or if they were still unaware. Part of her wanted to stand up, confront them immediately, demand answers. Another part of her felt too tired, too hurt to speak. She stood up slowly and poured herself a glass of water, her hands still unsteady. As she drank, she stared out the window, watching the familiar street outside. Life continued as usual for everyone else. Cars passed by, neighbors walked their dogs, children laughed in the distance. It felt strange that the world could move on while her own had suddenly stopped. She thought about her role in the family. She had always been the one who listened, who supported, who made excuses for others. She wondered if she had allowed things to reach this point by always putting herself last. The thought brought a quiet ache to her chest. Footsteps echoed faintly from the other side of the house. She froze, listening carefully. Someone was moving, unaware that she was there. The sound made her heart race again. She knew the moment of truth was approaching, whether she was ready or not. She moved back toward the living room, her mind racing. She did not know what she would say or how she would react. All she knew was that pretending nothing had happened was no longer an option. Whatever she had seen could not be unseen. Whatever she felt could not be pushed aside. As she waited, she reflected on how fragile families could be. From the outside, everything often looked fine, even perfect. Inside, however, small cracks could grow quietly, hidden behind routines and forced smiles. She wondered how many families around her carried similar secrets. Unseen and unspoken, her breathing slowed as she tried to prepare herself. She reminded herself that anger would not bring answers, and silence would not bring peace. She needed honesty, even if it hurt. She needed to understand, even if it changed everything. The door opened, and someone stepped into the room. Their expression shifted the moment they saw her standing there. Shock filled the space between them, thick and undeniable. No words were spoken, yet everything had already changed. She looked at them calmly, though her heart felt heavy. In that moment, she realized that this was only the beginning. What she had walked into was not just a single moment, but the result of years of distance, silence, and misunderstanding. The truth had finally surfaced, and there was no turning back. She did not speak yet. She simply stood there, letting the weight of the moment settle. She knew that what came next would be difficult, painful, and uncertain. But she also knew that avoiding it would only cause more damage. As the seconds passed, she felt a strange mix of fear and clarity. For the first time in a long while, she saw her family clearly, without the comforting blur of denial. The image was painful, but it was real. This unexpected return home had uncovered more than she ever imagined. It had opened a door she could not close again. And as she stood there, facing the silent shock in the room, she understood that her family's story was about to change in ways none of them had prepared for. The room stayed silent for a long moment after they saw her standing there. No one spoke, yet everything that needed to be understood passed between them in that heavy pause. She felt her chest tighten, not from anger, but from the deep ache of realizing how far apart they had grown while living under the same roof. She slowly moved forward and sat down, choosing not to raise her voice or ask questions right away. She wanted to understand before reacting. The person standing across from her avoided eye contact at first. Their shoulders were tense and their breathing uneven. It was clear they had not expected her to be home. The surprise on their face slowly turned into guilt. She noticed how tired they looked, how worn down, as if they had been carrying something heavy for a long time. That realization softened her heart. Even though the pain inside her remained sharp, she broke the silence gently, asking what was going on. Her voice was calm, but it trembled slightly despite her effort to stay strong. The words felt difficult to release, as if speaking them would make everything real. For a moment it seemed like no answer would come. Then, slowly, the truth began to unfold. Not all at once, but in small pieces. Like broken glass scattered across the floor, the explanation was not simple. It was layered with confusion, fear, and long-held frustration. What she had seen earlier was only a part of a much bigger story, a story that had started quietly, with small choices and unspoken needs, growing slowly into something that could no longer be hidden. As she listened, her mind replayed moments from the past that suddenly made sense. She thought about all the times she had sensed distance, but dismissed it as stress or tiredness. All the nights she had waited for conversations that never happened. She realized now that silence had become a habit for everyone in the house. Each person believed they were protecting the family by staying quiet, when in reality, they were pushing each other further away. As the conversation continued, another family member joined them, drawn by the tension in the air. Their expression shifted the moment they understood what was happening. Soon, everyone was present, sitting together in the same room, facing a truth none of them had planned to face that day. The room felt smaller, filled with emotions that had been locked away for years. She watched each face carefully. Some showed shame, others fear, and some carried quiet sadness. No one looked angry. That surprised her. She had expected defensiveness or denial, but instead, she saw people who were tired of pretending. That realization hurt, but it also gave her a small sense of hope. She spoke again, this time more firmly. She shared how betrayed she felt, not only by what she had seen, but by the fact that no one had trusted her enough to speak honestly. Her words were not cruel, but they were direct. She explained how lonely it felt to be physically present, but emotionally distant from the people she loved most. The response was emotional. Apologies came slowly, mixed with explanations and regrets. Each person shared their own pain, their own reasons for staying silent. One spoke about feeling misunderstood, another about fear of conflict, and another about not wanting to disappoint her. As she listened, tears filled her eyes, not just from hurt, but from understanding how deeply everyone had been struggling in their own way. She realized that everyone had been waiting for someone else to speak first. They had all assumed that silence was safer than honesty. That assumption had slowly broken the foundation of their family. She felt a wave of sadness for the time they had lost, time that could have been spent supporting each other instead of hiding. The conversation stretched on, moving between moments of pain and moments of clarity. At times, voices shook and tears were wiped away quietly. No one stormed out. No one shouted. The seriousness of the moment seemed to ground them all. They knew this conversation mattered too much to walk away from. She shared her own struggles, things she had kept hidden for years. How she felt pressure to hold everything together. How she often ignored her own needs to keep peace in the family. Admitting this felt like releasing a weight she had carried for too long. She noticed how surprised they looked, as if they had never considered that she, too, needed support. That realization shifted something in the room. The image they had of her began to change. She was no longer just the strong one, the responsible one, the one who fixed everything. She was human, tired, and in need of understanding just like everyone else. As the conversation deepened, they began to talk about how things had reached this point. Small misunderstandings that were never corrected. Assumptions that were never questioned. Expectations that were never spoken out loud. Each small issue had added another layer to the distance between them. She listened carefully, resisting the urge to interrupt or judge. She wanted to hear everything, even if it hurt. She knew that healing could not begin until the truth was fully spoken. The honesty in the room felt uncomfortable, but it also felt necessary. At one point, the conversation paused again. The silence this time felt different. It was no longer heavy with secrets, but filled with reflection. Everyone seemed lost in thought, processing what had been said. She looked around the room and felt a strange mix of grief and relief. She understood that this moment would divide their lives into two parts, the time before the truth and the time after. Nothing would ever return to the way it was. But perhaps that was not a bad thing. Perhaps the old way had not been working at all. She asked a simple but powerful question. What did they want moving forward? The question caught them off guard. No one had thought beyond the moment of discovery. Slowly, answers began to form. They spoke about wanting honesty, understanding, and a chance to rebuild trust. She made it clear that rebuilding would take time. Trust could not be repaired overnight. Pain would not disappear just because the truth was spoken. But she also expressed her willingness to try. As long as silence was no longer the solution, that honesty seemed to bring a sense of calm to the room. For the first time in a long while, they were facing a problem together instead of avoiding it separately. The atmosphere shifted slightly from tension to cautious hope. As evening approached, exhaustion set in. Emotional conversations had a way of draining energy quickly. She suggested taking a break, giving everyone time to reflect. No one objected. They all looked tired, but lighter somehow. Later, alone in her room, she replayed the day in her mind. She thought about how close she had come to ignoring her instincts again. If she had arrived home later or announced herself loudly, the truth might have stayed hidden even longer. That thought made her shiver. She also felt proud of herself for staying calm, for choosing understanding over anger. It had not been easy, and the pain was still there. But she knew she had taken the first step towards something healthier. As she lay awake that night, she wondered what the future would look like. She knew there would be difficult days ahead. Conversations that would hurt. Changes that would feel uncomfortable. But she also knew that pretending was no longer an option. The house felt different as night settled in. Not peaceful yet, but honest. She realized that honesty, even when painful, was better than living in a beautiful lie. With that thought, she finally allowed herself to rest. Knowing that the hardest part had only just begun, morning arrived quietly, as if the house itself was unsure how to behave after everything that had been said the night before. She woke up early, long before anyone else, her mind already heavy with thoughts. Sleep had come in short pieces, broken by memories and worries about what the day might bring. She lay still for a while, listening to the familiar sounds of the house, trying to decide how she felt. Nothing felt simple anymore. When she finally got out of bed, she noticed how different the air felt. It was not tense like before, but it was not calm either. It felt careful, as if everyone was walking on invisible lines, afraid to make a wrong step. She moved through the house slowly, making herself a simple breakfast. The small routines felt strange, like they belonged to a different version of her life. One by one, the others began to wake up. Their greetings were quiet and polite, almost formal. No one knew exactly what to say. She could see it in their eyes. They were trying to read her mood, just as she was trying to understand theirs. The truth was out now, but no one knew what to do with it yet. They sat together for breakfast, something they had done countless times before, but this time it felt different. Every movement felt noticed. Every sound felt louder. She watched them carefully, noticing small things she had overlooked in the past. The tired posture, the nervous hands, the forced smiles. These details told her more than words ever had. She decided to speak first. Not about the big issues, but about the day ahead. Simple things. Who needed to go out? Who would be home? What needed to be done? She wanted to remind everyone that life was still moving, even if everything felt shaken. The conversation remained calm, but underneath it, emotions waited, ready to surface. As the day went on, she found herself alone in the house again. The quiet returned, but this time it did not feel threatening. It gave her space to think. She sat by the window and looked outside, remembering how often she had used busyness as a way to avoid difficult conversations. Keeping busy had always been easier than facing pain. Her thoughts turned inward. She began to question her own role in everything that had happened. Not in a way that blamed herself, but in a way that sought understanding. She realized that she had taught everyone around her how to treat her by always saying yes, always staying silent, always putting her needs last. That realization hurt, but it also felt honest. Later that afternoon, one of them returned home earlier than expected. They stood awkwardly in the doorway, unsure whether to enter the room or leave her alone. She invited them in with a simple gesture. They sat across from each other, the distance between them filled with words that needed to be spoken. The conversation started slowly. They talked about small things at first, almost afraid to touch the deeper issues. Eventually, the silence became too loud to ignore. She gently asked how they were feeling. The question opened something that had been tightly closed for years. What followed was not dramatic, but it was deeply emotional. They spoke about feeling lost, about carrying pressure they did not know how to express. They admitted they had felt unseen, even while living under the same roof. As she listened, she felt a familiar ache in her chest, but also a growing sense of clarity. She responded honestly, sharing how alone she had felt despite always being surrounded by family. She explained how exhausting it was to always be strong, to always be the one who understood, while her own feelings remained unnoticed. Saying these words out loud felt freeing, even though it brought tears to her eyes. That moment marked a shift between them. The conversation was no longer about blame, but about understanding. They began to see each other as individuals, not just roles within a family. The strong one, the quiet one, the responsible one. Those labels had hidden the truth for too long. Over the next few days, similar conversations took place. Not all at once, and not always easily. Some talks ended in silence. Some ended in tears. Some ended without clear answers. But each one brought them closer to honesty. She noticed changes, small but meaningful. People began to ask how she was feeling. They checked in instead of assuming she was fine. She, in turn, tried to listen without immediately fixing things. She allowed herself to sit with discomfort instead of rushing past it. Not every moment was peaceful. There were days when frustration returned, when old habits tried to take control again. There were moments when she questioned whether facing the truth had been worth the pain. On those days, the weight felt almost unbearable. One evening, after a particularly difficult day, she found herself overwhelmed. She stepped outside for some air, letting the cool breeze calm her thoughts. She realized that healing was not a straight path. It moved forward and backward, sometimes all at once. Standing there, she made a quiet promise to herself. She would no longer disappear inside her own life. She would speak even when her voice shook. She would listen even when it hurt. Most importantly, she would stop carrying everything alone. Inside the house, she could hear voices again. Not tense ones, not secretive ones. Just normal conversation. The sound reminded her of what they were working toward. Not perfection, but connection. When she returned inside, she joined them without hesitation. The atmosphere was still fragile, but it was real. She understood now that real connection required effort from everyone, including herself. That night, as she prepared for bed, she reflected on how much had changed in such a short time. The truth had broken something, but it had also opened a door to honesty, to growth, to a different kind of family life. She knew the journey was far from over. There would be more difficult conversations ahead, more moments of doubt, more chances to choose between silence and truth. But for the first time, she felt ready. As she lay down, she felt a quiet strength settle within her. Not the kind that comes from control or sacrifice, but the kind that comes from honesty. She closed her eyes, knowing that whatever came next, she would face it with open eyes and an open heart. Time began to move differently after those honest conversations. Days no longer felt rushed, yet they were heavier in meaning. She noticed how every interaction now carried awareness. Words were chosen more carefully. Silences were noticed instead of ignored. It felt uncomfortable at times, but also strangely relieving. For the first time in years, nothing was being hidden on purpose. She started paying closer attention to herself. Simple emotions she once pushed aside now demanded space. Some mornings she felt hopeful, believing the family was finally moving toward something better. Other mornings she felt drained, unsure if everyone would stay committed once things became difficult again. She accepted both feelings, understanding that healing did not follow a straight line. One afternoon, she decided it was time to talk about the future. Not just feelings, but real changes. She gathered everyone together, not in anger or urgency, but with calm determination. She explained that honesty alone was not enough. They needed action, effort, and consistency if they wanted real change. At first, the room felt tense again. Change always carried fear. She could see it in their expressions. Some were afraid of failing. Others were afraid of being judged. She acknowledged those fears openly, reminding them that mistakes were part of growth. But silence was no longer acceptable. They began discussing small but meaningful changes. Regular conversations without distractions. Clear communication instead of assumptions. Respecting boundaries that had never been discussed before. These ideas sounded simple, and she knew how challenging they could be in practice. She made it clear that she would also change. She would stop pretending she was always fine. She would ask for help when she needed it. She would speak up before resentment had time to grow. Saying these things out loud felt empowering. It reminded her that strength did not mean silence. Not everyone responded immediately. Some listened quietly, needing time to process. Others nodded, clearly willing but unsure how to begin. She did not pressure them. She understood that understanding often came before action. As weeks passed, life tested their commitment. Old habits returned when stress increased. There were moments when voices rose and patience wore thin. During those moments, she felt frustration creeping back in. She wondered if the effort was worth it. One evening, a disagreement surfaced unexpectedly. It started over something small, but quickly grew emotional. In the past, this would have ended in cold silence. This time, she stopped the conversation gently and suggested a pause. That pause changed everything. Instead of walking away, they stayed. They breathed. They listened. The conversation resumed with honesty instead of accusation. It was not perfect, but it was real. When it ended, she felt exhausted yet proud. They had handled conflict without hiding. That moment became a quiet turning point. It showed her that progress was possible, even when emotions ran high. It reminded her that growth did not mean the absence of conflict, but the ability to face it together. She also began to notice changes within herself. She felt lighter, even on difficult days. Speaking her truth had removed a weight she did not realize she had been carrying. She felt more present, more aware of her own needs and limits. One morning, she caught herself smiling while making breakfast. The sound of normal conversation filled the kitchen. Nothing dramatic was happening, yet it felt meaningful. These ordinary moments now felt precious, built on effort rather than assumption. She reflected often on how close everything had come to falling apart. If she had not walked in that day, the distance might have continued growing quietly. The truth might have stayed hidden, slowly breaking them beyond repair. That thought reminded her why honesty mattered. Not every day brought progress. There were setbacks that left her discouraged. On those days, she reminded herself that change required patience. Years of silence could not be undone in weeks. Healing needed time, repetition, and forgiveness. She learned to forgive not only others but herself. She forgave herself for staying silent too long, for choosing peace over truth, for believing that sacrifice was the same as love. Letting go of that guilt allowed her to move forward without bitterness, as trust slowly rebuilt. Deeper conversations emerged. They talked about fears, regrets, and hopes they had never shared before. These talks were not always easy, but they created understanding where judgment once lived. One night, as they sat together quietly, she realized something important. The family she wanted was not one without problems, but one that faced problems openly. That realization changed her expectations. Perfection was no longer the goal. Connection was. She noticed how the house itself felt different. Lighter, warmer, not because everything was fixed, but because nothing was hidden. The space felt honest, and honesty brought peace. Even when answers were still unclear, there were moments when fear returned. Fear that things might slip back into old patterns. When that happened, she chose to speak instead of withdraw. Each time she did, it reinforced the new foundation they were building. As she lay in bed one night, she thought about the future. She knew challenges would come again. Life would test them in new ways. But she also knew they now had tools they never used before. Words, listening, understanding. She felt proud of the courage it had taken to face the truth. Proud of everyone for staying, when it would have been easier to walk away. That pride was quiet, but deeply felt. The journey was not over, but something important had shifted. The family was no longer held together by silence, but by effort, by choice, by honesty. As sleep slowly claimed her, she felt a calm she had not felt in years. Not because everything was perfect, but because everything was real. And that reality, though sometimes painful, finally felt like home. Life slowly found a new rhythm after everything that had happened. It was not the same rhythm as before, and she no longer expected it to be. The days were calmer in some ways, heavier in others, but they felt honest. That honesty made all the difference. She woke up each morning with a quiet awareness that things were still fragile, yet real. She noticed how trust returned in small moments. A shared look across the room. A question asked instead of an assumption made. A pause before reacting. These moments might have seemed insignificant to an outsider, but to her, they meant everything. They showed effort. They showed care. One afternoon, while sitting alone in the living room, she thought about the person she had been before that unexpected day. She remembered how often she had ignored her own voice, how often she had believed that staying silent was the same as keeping peace. Now, she understood that peace built on silence never truly lasted. The family still had disagreements. Sometimes emotions rose quickly, and patience ran thin. But now, those moments were faced instead of avoided. When misunderstandings happened, they were discussed openly. Even when conversations felt uncomfortable, they did not retreat into silence anymore. She found strength in that change. Not the loud kind of strength, but the steady kind. The kind that allowed her to speak calmly even when her heart felt heavy. The kind that allowed her to listen without preparing a defense. She felt more grounded than she had in years. There were moments when the past returned unexpectedly. A familiar habit. A careless word. A sudden fear that things might fall apart again. During those moments, she reminded herself that growth did not erase the past. It learned from it. She also noticed how others had changed. They seemed more present, more thoughtful. They checked in with her, not out of obligation, but genuine care. That simple shift made her feel seen in a way she had not realized she was missing. One evening, they sat together quietly, not talking much, just sharing the space. The silence no longer felt heavy or threatening. It felt comfortable, safe. She realized then that silence itself was not the enemy. Unspoken truth was. She reflected on how one unplanned moment had reshaped everything. Walking in without warning had forced the truth into the open. At the time, it felt like everything was breaking. Now she saw that it had been the beginning of rebuilding. She thought about how many families lived in quiet distance, believing it was normal. Believing that love meant endurance rather than understanding. She hoped quietly that their story might remind others that speaking up mattered as time passed. The family began making new memories. Simple ones. Shared meals. Laughter that felt natural instead of forced. Conversations that wandered without fear. These moments did not erase the pain, but they softened it. She learned to forgive fully, not because forgetting was easy, but because holding on hurt more. Forgiveness did not mean ignoring what happened. It meant choosing not to let it control the future. She also forgave herself. For not seeing sooner, for being afraid of conflict, for believing that her needs mattered less. That self-forgiveness brought peace she had long denied herself. One quiet morning, as sunlight filled the room, she felt grateful. Not because life was perfect, but because it was real. Because she was no longer living behind a smile meant to hide discomfort. She understood now that families were not defined by the absence of problems, but by how they faced them. Strength was not measured by how much one could endure in silence, but by the courage to speak honestly. The house felt like home again. Not because everything was fixed, but because everyone belonged fully. Without hiding parts of themselves, that sense of belonging was something she had not realized she was missing. As she moved forward, she carried one lesson with her above all others. Truth, even when painful, opened doors that silence never could. Walking through those doors required courage, patience, and love. She knew the future would still bring challenges. Life always did. But she no longer feared them the way she once had. She trusted that honesty would guide them, even when answers were unclear. Standing in the same doorway she had walked through unannounced that day, she paused for a moment. The memory felt distant now, yet powerful. She smiled softly, knowing that a single step taken without warning had changed everything. What began as an ordinary day had become a turning point, a reminder that truth had the power to break and heal at the same time. And as she stepped forward into the life they were now building together, she felt ready for whatever came next. Life did not stop testing them just because they had learned how to speak honestly. In many ways, the real test began after things felt calmer. Once the shock faded and routines returned, deeper habits revealed themselves. She noticed how easy it was to slip back into old patterns without realizing it. Some days felt smooth. Conversations flowed naturally, and understanding came easily. Other days felt heavy, filled with misunderstandings that reminded her how fragile progress could be. She learned that healing was not about reaching a finish line, but about choosing the same effort again and again. She became more aware of her reactions. When frustration arose, she paused instead of responding immediately. That pause gave her space to understand what she was really feeling. Often, it was not anger, but fear of being unheard again. Recognizing that fear helped her speak more clearly. One afternoon, a situation arose that would have been ignored in the past. A decision had been made without including her. It was not done with bad intention, but it triggered something familiar inside her. The old urge to stay quiet returned, telling her it was not worth bringing up. She sat with that feeling for a long moment. She remembered the promise she had made to herself. Silence was no longer an option. With calm determination, she addressed it openly. Her voice remained steady even though her heart raced. The response surprised her. Instead of defensiveness, there was understanding. An apology followed, sincere and immediate. That moment felt powerful, not because the mistake had not happened, but because it was acknowledged without resistance. That experience strengthened her confidence. It showed her that speaking up did not destroy peace. It protected it. She felt a quiet pride in herself for choosing honesty. Even when it felt uncomfortable, she also noticed how the others were changing in their own ways. They became more aware of how their actions affected each other. Small check-ins became normal. Asking instead of assuming became a habit. These changes were subtle, but meaningful. There were still moments of tension. Sometimes emotions spilled over and words came out wrong. When that happened, she reminded herself that perfection was never the goal. Growth was. One evening, a difficult topic surfaced again. It was something connected to the past, something that had not fully healed yet. The room grew quiet as everyone waited to see how it would be handled. She took a deep breath and spoke carefully. She expressed how that memory still affected her without accusing or blaming. The honesty in her words set the tone for the conversation. Others listened closely, their expressions serious but open. The discussion was emotional but respectful. There were pauses, tears, and moments of reflection. No one rushed to fix things. They allowed the feelings to exist without judgment. Afterward, she felt emotionally drained, yet strangely relieved. Speaking about unfinished pain had lifted another weight. She realized that healing did not mean forgetting. It meant understanding and acceptance. As weeks turned into months, the house continued to change. It felt warmer, more alive. Laughter returned in ways that felt genuine. Even quiet moments carried comfort instead of tension. She found herself enjoying simple things again. Morning light through the window. Shared meals without forced conversation. Even disagreements felt less threatening now that they were met with honesty. She reflected often on how one unexpected moment had shifted everything. Walking in unannounced had not only revealed the truth but had revealed her own strength, a strength she had underestimated for years. She also understood that growth required maintenance. Just like a home needed care to stay strong, relationships needed attention to remain healthy. Neglect allowed cracks to form again. On difficult days, she reminded herself why the effort mattered. She remembered the loneliness of being surrounded by people yet feeling unseen. That memory guided her choices. She learned to ask for space when she needed it, without guilt. She learned to say no when something felt overwhelming. These boundaries did not create distance. They created respect. Others began to do the same. They expressed their needs more clearly, without fear of conflict. The household felt more balanced because everyone carried responsibility for its emotional health. One quiet night, as she sat alone, she felt a deep sense of gratitude, not for the pain that had occurred, but for the courage it had awakened. Without that painful moment, growth might never have begun. She understood now that love was not about endurance alone. It was about awareness, effort, and honesty. Love required presence, not perfection. As she prepared for rest, she felt steady. Not because everything was resolved, but because she trusted their ability to face whatever came next. That trust felt stronger than any certainty. The journey continued, not without challenges, but with purpose. And as she moved forward, she carried one truth with her above all others. Real change begins the moment silence ends. Change did not arrive all at once. It came quietly, through small choices made every day. She noticed it in the way mornings felt calmer now, without the tight feeling in her chest that used to greet her as soon as she woke up. Even on difficult days, she no longer felt alone in the same way. That made all the difference. She had learned to trust her voice. Speaking up no longer felt like a risk that might break everything. Instead, it felt like a tool that protected what mattered most. She no longer waited for the right moment to say how she felt. She created the moment by being honest. The family continued to grow into this new way of living. There were still disagreements, but they no longer carried the same weight. Conflict became something to move through, not something to fear. That shift changed the energy inside the home. One day, a situation came up that reminded her of how far they had come. Someone admitted a mistake openly, without excuses or blame. The room stayed calm. No one reacted with anger. Instead, there was understanding and a willingness to fix what went wrong. Watching this, she felt a quiet sense of pride. She realized then that trust had returned. Not because the past was forgotten, but because honesty had become normal. That honesty created safety, and safety allowed people to be real. She also noticed how she treated herself differently now. She rested when she was tired. She said no when her energy was low. She stopped measuring her worth by how much she gave to others. These changes felt small, but they transformed her from the inside. There were moments when fear tried to return, fear that things could fall apart again. When that happened, she reminded herself that she was no longer the same person she had been before. She now knew how to speak, how to listen, and how to protect her peace. As time passed, the memory of that unexpected day no longer hurt the way it once had. Instead, it felt like a reminder that truth, even when painful, could lead to growth. One quiet evening, as she sat alone with her thoughts, she felt grateful. Grateful for the courage she found when she needed it most. Grateful for the chance to rebuild instead of walking away. She understood now that families were not perfect systems. They were living things that needed care, honesty, and patience. Ignoring problems did not protect love. Facing them did. She looked around the house and saw comfort instead of tension. Laughter instead of silence. Even the quiet moments felt warm now, not heavy. The change was real. She knew challenges would still come. Life always tested relationships, but she trusted their ability to face those challenges as challenges together. That trust felt stronger than certainty. Standing by the door one last time, she took a deep breath. She smiled softly, knowing that walking in unannounced had not destroyed her family. It had saved it. And as she stepped forward into the life they were continuing to build, she carried one truth with her forever. Honesty is not the end of peace. It is the beginning of it.